Krystal, what are you taking a look at?
So we are about 6 months into an extraordinary period of interest rate hiking by the Fed. And as you know, if you watch this show, the Fed has been trying to get inflation under control by crushing wages, tanking the housing market, and spiking unemployment. In addition to the inherent cruelty of this approach, there's another big problem with it. Doesn't really seem to be working. Now, I see some economists saying inflation is just about to ease up, but well, so far, these are the numbers. The so-called core consumer price index rose 6.6% year over year in September. That is the highest increase that we've had since August of 1982. And there are some very good reasons why the Fed's actions alone might not be enough to get inflation under control, which is the Fed really has no control over the primary drivers of inflation, namely energy prices, which are being buffeted by all sorts of events from the Ukraine war, our sanctions, Saudi's manipulations, and notably, the Fed also has no control over the corporate profiteering, which has been rampant, as CEOs have bragged about their ability to use the excuse of inflation to jack up their prices. Congresswoman Katie Porter made this point flawlessly in a recent congressional hearing. Take a look.
According to this chart, what is the biggest driver of inflation during the pandemic? The dark blue is the recent period.
It would be corporate profits.
And what is that percentage?
It is 54%, and that number does stay that level of high if you update that number to more recent numbers as well.
So over half of the increased prices people are paying are coming from increases in corporate profits.
Yes, the unit price index is reflected in corporate profits as opposed to other costs.
And how does that compare to historically, to other periods of inflation or over other periods of economic time?
As reflected there and in other analysis, it is significantly higher in this recovery, 11.5%.
And what is it today?
53%.
53%. Now, I want to dig into this point today about corporate profiteering driving inflation with a very specific example that comes from the housing market. Now, at this point, one of the major drivers of inflation is shelter costs. That's rent and that's housing. And as it turns out, ProPublica has just exposed what essentially amounts to a nationwide landlord cartel that is colluding to raise rent prices across the country. Now, this story reveals the untold truth of why the rent is so damn high, and it really has little to do with the workings of the Fed. Fed Chair Jerome Powell might have immense power, but he cannot himself break up an exploitative landlord cartel. Now, it turns out one company has come to dominate the market for setting rent prices nationwide. And that company happens to have been architected by a dude who was caught in an airline price-fixing scandal back in the 80s. So here is that story from ProPublica. Quote, rent going up, one company's algorithm could be why. Texas-based RealPage's YieldStar software helps landlords set prices for apartments across the U.S. With rent soaring, critics are concerned that the company's proprietary algorithm is hurting competition. Now, the article details how RealPage executives brag about being responsible for the insane increases in rent prices nationwide, exclaiming, quote, never before have we seen these numbers. Another executive explained how using the software made it easier for landlords to overcome their humanity in order to raise rents by eye-watering amounts. Quote, as a property manager, very few of us would be willing to actually raise rents double digits within a single month by doing it manually. Again, they're saying this like it's a good thing, a selling point of YieldStar's algorithm technology. In a testimonial, the director of revenue management for JVM Realty gushed, the beauty of YieldStar is that it pushes you to go to places you wouldn't have gone if you weren't using it. And if that wasn't blunt enough, one of the developers behind the algorithm informed ProPublica that, quote, leasing agents had too much empathy compared to computer-generated pricing. Isn't that lovely that landlords are saved the emotional burden of having to actually contemplate the impact of these massive price hikes? They can remain numb to the human toll that their actions are taking, the brutality of it disintermediated through a machine, as of course the devastation for the renter class remains. Now, it's not hard to figure out why taking the cruelty out of pushing people out of their apartments is a necessary part of what YieldStar is doing here. ProPublica documents how YieldStar pushes a strategy of raising rents even beyond what the market can really bear, calculating in all of its cold robotic efficiency that higher vacancy rates are more than made up for by the extra profits from higher rents. So YieldStar is raising rents not only directly with their pricing, but by effectively lowering the rental stock that is available, putting pressure on all parts of the rental market. They would rather have apartments sit empty than to rent them out at more reasonable rates. What's more, in areas where YieldStar has been heavily adopted, the algorithm creates a sort of a feedback loop that can lead to ever-escalating prices. So basically, YieldStar and their algorithm, they take into account local market conditions, But they are also creating those local market conditions by setting prices for so many landlords. You can see how this gets into being a feedback loop. Now, this is really apparent in the city of Seattle. Rents there have skyrocketed more than 30% over the past several years. ProPublica found a neighborhood where 70% of all the units in that neighborhood were priced by YieldStar in their algorithm, and they went and they interviewed some local renters. The results were incredibly predictable. One company told ProPublica their rent increased by a third in a single year. They were forced to move out of the city entirely. A nearby building that was one of the few that was not priced by YieldStar, they had increased rent but only moderately during the same period. One tenant there said he had seen his rent go up by $50. That's a 3.9% increase. Now, this model is not just morally bankrupt, it also might be illegal. After all, YieldStar has basically become a monopoly after a controversial Trump-era merger between YieldStar's owner RealPage and their largest competitor, Lease Rent Options. What's more, YieldStar algorithmically coordinates prices across markets. Just because it's technology that's doing the colluding rather than human beings directly, that doesn't change the fact it's still collusion. But even beyond that, YieldStar users are encouraged to directly meet and share information, which they do both online and in formalized annual conferences and quarterly conference calls. Direct collusion, indirect collusion, founded by a dude who was caught price fixing. I rest my case. And here is what Jerome Powell and the Fed can do about it. Not a goddamn thing. Raising interest rates and crushing workers is not going to move the needle on collusion-driven rent hikes. But it won't stop the Fed from trying, of course. Rather than crushing wages and spiking unemployment, we should be crushing monopolies, breaking up cartels, and shaming the companies that are exploiting our people. This thing was astonishing to me. No idea. Cable news is ripping us apart, dividing the country, making it impossible to function as a society, and making it impossible to know just what is true and what is false. But the good news is they are failing and they know it.
That is why we're building something new, a new mainstream, a healthier one, something more trustworthy, something that we are going to need in one of the most pivotal times in American history. We are building up here for the midterms, for the upcoming presidential election, but we need your help. So if you can help us out by becoming a premium member today at breakingpoints.com, we're trying to change America for the better and the entire world.
So what are you waiting for, guys? Go to breakingpoints.com and sign up and help us build a new mainstream.